The Hideout, written and read by Aaron Walther, based off an illustration by Ed Bickford, edited by Jason Green. Kelvin's beating heart pounded against his ribcage. The sound of blood pumping through his torso pulsated in his ears. The blood itself oozed across his chest, over his shoulder, and onto his mechanical right arm, where he lost all physical sensations. The pit fights were a dirty, loathsome place. For most of the inhabitants of the planet Sahra-2, pit fights were the only distraction from an arid, boring life. For Kelvin, they were a way to pass the time and pay the bills. Kelvin was a rising star in the pit fights. His career only just started a little over one Sahran year prior, but he maintained an undefeated record in all that time. Gamblers, commentators, and business insiders speculated that he could become a real champion. More conservative pit fight fans decreed that the odds were against him. He may have champion potential, they conceded, but it was evident to anyone that watched Kelvin fight that he lacked a certain ferociousness that all champion pit fighters have. They were not wrong. At first glance, Kelvin appeared to be an average pit fight challenger. He was part man, part robot. In Kelvin's case, he had an oversized robotic right arm and entirely mechanical legs from the thighs down. Each fighter had their own combination of flesh and machine, but they all shared this man-machine hybrid quality. As long as there was a human brain making decisions, nothing was off limits. Kelvin was tall, nearly 2 meters, and thanks to his metallic limbs, he weighed much more than the average person. He regularly exercised his organic left arm, but it would forever be dwarfed by the monstrous attachment on his right. Kelvin's opponent was a scrawny, sorry excuse for a fighter. He was a short, pot-bellied rascal with 2 robotic fists that ended at the wrist and nothing else. He boasted that his rocket punch was his ticket to the championship. Kelvin had just taken one directly to the chest and was not impressed. It struck him hard, yes, and even drew blood, but any serious attack should have killed him upon impact. Kelvin spat out a black mix of mucus and blood before following through with his counterattack. In one swift motion, he leapt toward his opponent, spun his large right fist around, and smashed him into the ground. The boastful enemy struggled to breathe as he found his neck pinched between 2 large rusted steel fingers and the dry rock that made up the pit floor. He impotently fired off his second rocket fist, which flew into the elevated fan stands and maimed an onlooker. Kelvin's opponent struggled and choked out an admission of loss before losing consciousness completely. A true professional, Kelvin relented just in time to save his handless opponent's life. The elevated seats that surrounded the man-made pit were filled with spectators. Kelvin lifted his giant right arm and waved toward the crowd, causing an eruption of cheers. He came out victorious, as he always did, because he was not a quitter, but he felt no exhilaration of joy because the pit fights were not a life he chose. He did not revel in his victory and quickly exited. "What in the 7 desert hells was that?" Kelvin followed his normal after-fight routine and sat on a bench in the back room while the medic patched up his open wounds and the mechanic fine-tuned his lifeless limbs. "How did that little goblin manage to hit you? What were you doing, daydreaming or something?" Kelvin's manager, Jerome, was yelling at him. "I mean, I understand the need for showmanship. Give the crowd a bit of shock and awe and all, but come on! If that scrub had been a serious contender, he could have broken your streak. Did you even know the fight started?" Jerome unconsciously scratched at a scar on his left forearm as he berated Kelvin. Like Kelvin, Jerome also had a transplanted arm, but unlike Kelvin, it was no mechanical abomination. Jerome was fortunate enough to have an organic transplant from a donor. He was unfortunate, though, that the transplant was a wildly different skin tone than the rest of his body. An organic transplant was difficult to acquire and usually only affordable to the executives and middle managers of the Kuiper Corporation, the mining company that owned Sahra-2. Finding something that matches your own skin was nearly impossible. Jerome's sleek, ebony arm contrasted strangely with the rest of his hairy, olive complexion. An off-worlder may instinctively take a second gawk were they to see it for the first time, but for the inhabitants of Sahra-2, mismatched skin tones and body parts were a relatively common occurrence. Regular injuries from dangerous mining conditions and the birth mutations and deformities caused by Sahra-2's weak atmosphere have created a large demand for clean limbs and organs. Most people had to make do with clunky mechanical transplants, but if you were flush with currency, you could obtain an organic replacement. Jerome was flush with currency. Jerome, however, did not work for the Kuiper Corporation. He made his money playing off-world stocks. He got the organic transplant to replace a deformed hand that never fully developed in utero. I put a lot of money into you, kid. I expect a return on that investment. Kelvin's back hurt. The mechanic fiddled with two large bolts affixed to Kelvin's trapezius muscles. They were designed to provide structural support for his oversized robotic right arm. Without them, or the planet's slightly weaker than normal gravitational pull, the heavy metal transplant would rip right off the body. Most practical robotic limbs were made of plastics and other lighter materials, but Kelvin's limbs were made of sturdier stuff. Kelvin was made for the pit fights. Are you even listening to me? Jerome shouted, jabbing a dark finger into Kelvin's face. Everything worked out, Kelvin flatly responded. Jerome scoffed. Yeah? Well, maybe it did this time. Next time you might not be so lucky. Don't worry about next time. I'll do better. Jerome took a swig from a hidden flask which contained expensive liquor, another privilege of the wealthy, before sighing and turning to leave. Fine. I hope you do. Don't make me regret sponsoring you. Kelvin sat in silence as the medic and mechanic finished checking him over. He didn't particularly like Jerome, but he felt a certain amount of gratitude and obligation toward him. Jerome may have had a churlish temperament, but he'd never done wrong by Kelvin. In fact, he'd saved Kelvin's life. For amputees of Sahra II, life was difficult. To survive, you had to rent space from the Kuiper Corporation. The only honest work that paid a sustainable wage was mining, though a few people had carved out careers in niche pop-up industries, such as the pit fights. 2 centuries prior, scientists of Earth cracked the barrier faster than light travel, and the first great expansion began. Though the vast cosmos now appeared to be within reaching distance of humanity, finding habitable planets was still difficult, as they were paradoxically rare. Most of the early explorers and settlers were large corporations who could afford the insurmountable costs of space travel. One such company, the Kuiper Corporation, was not looking for a second Earth. They were looking for a planet with exploitable assets. They found one such planet, named it Sahra II, and claimed it and settled it for themselves under interspatial Earth law. Sahra II was not even that rich in resources compared to other planets, but its relatively lower gravity made it easier and cheaper to launch rockets to transport heavy minerals off its surface than a richer planet with a thicker atmosphere. The profit margin was thin, but it was there. Despite the land itself not being ideal to live on, it was valuable to rival corporations with interests in undercutting Kuiper Corporation's monopoly of the planetary mineral rights. At one point in time, Kelvin had his entire life planned out ahead of him. He was practically guaranteed a job at the Kuiper Corporation, if for no other reason than his father was a veteran miner that held a lot of sway in the Union. Even without the familial connection, as a healthy young man, he would have been eagerly accepted. Though not conventionally handsome, the fact that he was purely organic, with no visible mutations or amputations, made him very popular with young women as well. It didn't take long before he found himself a committed relationship with a beautiful young girl and a long, dependable career with the Kuiper Corporation. But fate can be cruel. Months into his tenure on the mining site, he was the victim of a terrible accident. He awoke in a hospital several weeks later. The beautiful young girl was gone. He was informed that he was now paraplegic as a result of his own carelessness. The union conceded that the company owed him nothing. He had lost an arm and the use of both legs. He was lucky to be alive, depending on your point of view. Robbed of the ability to work and support himself, Kelvin was now a dependent. His father had a good job and could probably have afforded to take care of him, but Kelvin would have remained a burden for the rest of his life. If he had lost but one limb in the accident, an inorganic transplant would have been reasonable. He probably could have gotten his job back too, but with the loss of his legs, he was almost a lost cause. Even a Kuiper Corporation upper-middle manager would struggle to cover those costs. Fortunately, Kelvin did not have to ponder his dire situation for very long. Shortly after he awoke from his coma, he was approached by Jerome, who sought to be Kelvin's sponsor. On Sahra II, it was common for transplantees to pay for their operations by way of a sponsor. The sponsor would front the money for the transplant, and in return the transplantee would agree to a subservient contract for a specified amount of time in order to effectively pay back the cost. Most sponsors were Kuiper Corporation management and shareholders who had accepted whatever part-time work the transplantee could perform, such as cooking, housekeeping, or mechanical repair. Jerome did not need any such services. He was looking to enter the world of pit fighting and was willing to gamble his money on Kelvin, which Kelvin accepted. Thus, Kelvin found himself thrown into the world of underground fighting, and though he had no great desire to be a pit fight champion, Kelvin's stubborn sense of obligation motivated him to try. Once he was finally released by his mechanic, Kelvin casually strolled through Johnstontown on his way to his weekly support group. Johnstontown was the largest of the 3 domed cities on Saratu. It was named after the sitting CEO of the Kuiper Corporation at the time of its founding. The planet Saratu, aptly named after an ancient Earth word for desert, contained little water. Due to its close proximity to its star, the planet temperature was too hot to sustain life. Likewise, the thin atmosphere did not adequately protect from solar radiation. An unprotected human could not survive outside the domed city for more than an hour before dying of exposure. The heavy domes that covered the cities of Saratu were designed to reflect heat and radiation and create a livable habitat for the employees of the mining company. Johnstontown was a cramped, messy city. Buildings were stacked on top of other buildings as high as they could go before scraping the roof of the dome. With upward real estate limited by the restrictive dome, further expansion could only continue underground, which had to be strictly regulated by the Kuiper Corporation to prevent the inadvertent destruction of the city's foundation. There was practically a second city's worth of mazes and caves dug deep into the rock under the surface of Johnstontown. They became colloquially known as the pits. This is how the pit fights got their name. New living quarters were constantly being opened up underground, but there were rumors that the pits were expanding too fast and could possibly compromise the structural safety of the dome. None of this was of any interest to Kelvin, however. It was simply the state of living, and he didn't concern himself with any history or future of the city. His only concern was being on time for his support group meeting. "Everyone, I'd like to introduce you to Maddie, our newest member of the group," said Dale, the leader of the weekly amputee and transplantee support meeting. Dale was entirely too friendly for only having one organic limb. His 2 robotic legs gave him an awkward, stilted gait, which Kelvin self-consciously worried he also had. More distracting, however, was his organic left arm, which many suspected to have originally been female due to looking slightly too short and thin on his tall, male frame. Everyone except for Kelvin said hi to Maddie. "I don't want to steal your thunder, Maddie. Go ahead and tell us your story. How did you come to our little group here?" Dale chirped. A short, muscular man with one arm stood in front of the group of incomplete people and said, "Well, there's not much to tell, I guess. I was working out on Site 3, the one with the big sonic drill, and long story short, my coworker wasn't paying attention to the space intervals of the vacuum mine doors, and he just barely made it out alive, but rookie mistake, really. I should have never let it get to that point." Maddie trailed off, and Dale took over the presentation. "Maddie was injured in a mining accident," Dale said, "like many of us here. But we're here to support Maddie and show him that a transplantee, whether it be robotic or organic, can be just as productive as anybody else. Right, folks?" The room was filled with the positively mild enthusiasm of a crowd of recent amputees. "Kelvin," Dale said, "you've done quite well for yourself, despite suffering one of the worst mining accidents in the Kuiper Corporation's history. Maybe you could offer Maddie some words of encouragement, yeah?" Kelvin wasn't happy to hear this request, but it wasn't unexpected. Kelvin had become somewhat of a celebrity icon among the people of Saratu. Dale's large, permanent smile and friendly eyes pierced right through Kelvin's placid demeanor. "Yeah, sure, I can chat with him a bit. Answer any questions he has," Kelvin said. "Great. So now that introductions are out of the way, who has a story they want to share with the group?" Dale asked in his typically cloying way. A woman stood up. She was gaunt and shivering. She had 2 wiry, robotic arms beneath a cloak, but everyone knew they were there. She stuttered when she spoke. "It's not been a good week for me," she tried to say. "Oh, now, Allie, remember you're among friends here. You don't need to hold back from us," said Dale. "It's just, I thought I was getting over it. Like you say in rule number 3, accept the things you can't control and devote yourself to the things you can. But I had another episode at work the other day. I was working at the restaurant, like always. Everything was fine. I'm still not over the loss of touch, but I can work again. Almost as good as I used to be. But I was taking an order out to a table. A group of rich wives all gossiping about their middle management husbands. One of them, I saw it. Allie paused, trying to hold in her words, but they burst out of her mouth uncontrollably. It was my hand! I know it was! Dale politely interrupted. Now, Allie, we've talked about this. It's not uncommon for... Allie kept talking as tears welled in her eyes. That fat cow was stuffing her face with my hand. She had my whole missing arm that was stolen from me. She had my freckles, my mole, my fingernails. I just... Allie's stuttering devolved into miserable sobbing. The room was mostly silent except for the occasional cough. Kelvin was bored. It's true that poor Allie got a raw deal. She was a victim of the black market harvesters, a common problem on Sa-Ratu. It was speculated that upwards of 40% of all organic limb transplants were bought from the black market. Roughly 35% came from deceased donors, and another 25% were from living donors that actually preferred a mechanical transplant. The Kuiper Corporation's internal security team was investigating a potential crime ring that was harvesting and supplying spare limbs to the black market, but they had yet to make any arrests. Allie cried, while Dale and the rest of the group tried to comfort her. Kelvin impatiently checked the clock. It's not that he didn't feel bad for Allie, but there was nothing he could do about it. She should be happy she was alive, at least. Kelvin begrudgingly spoke with Maddie, who was taking the loss of his arm very well, all things considered. Maddie just wanted to get back to work. He had a family to support, and the Kuiper Corporation's disability payments were not sufficient. Kelvin told Maddie about a few reliable mechanical transplants that were designed specifically to work with Kuiper Corporation equipment. The company even let you take the transplant first and pay back the cost of the operation through a garnished wage installment plan. Maddie would be back to work in no time. Kelvin made no mention of the pit fights. The meeting finally ended. Kelvin signed a few autographs for someone's kid and left. Though Kelvin was a minor celebrity for fighting in the pits, he was fortunate enough that he didn't have to live in the pits. Shortly after his own mining accident, Kelvin's father died on a Kuiper Corporation mining site. The incident was ruled to be a failure in the company machinery due to a design flaw. Kelvin was awarded his deceased father's pension as per the union contract, which came in the form of a mid-level apartment in Johnstontown and a small but substantial cash payout. It was enough to afford him a mediocre standard of living without having to work for a short period. He was able to stretch the pension several years longer than the average family would have, since he now lived completely alone. His mother committed suicide when he was a small child. Day slowly turned to night as Kelvin walked home through the busy streets above the pits. Most people walked everywhere in Johnstontown, and there was little room in the cramped city for large vehicles. Aside from a few highways that led from the Kuiper Corporation's main offices to the dome entrances, the city was a maze of alleys and walkways that could barely fit a single-seated motorbike. The stale, recycled air of the city intermixed with the stench of a dirty crowd. It was one of the most subtly oppressive aspects of living in Johnstontown. A young woman walked briskly past Kelvin. She was overtly perfumed, and left a welcome trail of fragrances behind her. She had no deformities or mechanical transplants, which made her stand out in the crowd of people making their way through the populous city. She was flanked on either side by two large men, who were most likely bodyguards. Pure people, particularly young women, did not walk alone in Johnstontown. They were prime targets for harvesters. The ambient noise of the bloated city was cut sharply by a painful scream. Kelvin's ear twitched. He could not tell if it was a man or a woman. It was probably another harvester attack. Kelvin chuckled at the thought of getting jumped by harvesters on his way home. How disappointed would they be to catch such a sorry victim as himself, with only one organic limb? What a waste of time that would be. Once home, Kelvin cooked himself a modest meal and watched a bit of the Kuiper Corporation telecast to catch up on the news of the city. The head of Kuiper Miners' Union was giving a speech about upcoming negotiations over miner pensions. Kelvin watched the union boss carefully. It appeared that he had gotten an organic transplant since the last time Kelvin saw him. Kelvin couldn't remember his name, but part of the reason the union boss was so devoted to his job was that he had been maimed on site early in his career. He was practically a poster child for the disenfranchised worker. The last time Kelvin saw him, he wore his clunky mechanical arm transplant with pride, a constant reminder of the company's lack of empathy toward its workers. Kelvin stared carefully at his display monitor with uncharacteristic interest. The union boss's new organic arm looked strange. A stray thought wiggled its way into Kelvin's mind, but was quickly dismissed. No, there was simply no way the union boss was wearing Kelvin's old arm. Kelvin's arm wasn't stolen. It was destroyed in an accident. Kelvin shut off the telecast and decided to just go to bed. It had been a long day, what with the fight and the support group meeting right afterwards. He had another big day ahead of him, too. Aside from his normal athletic training, he had a physical therapy session to attend. The physical therapy sessions were to help him train his mechanical arm for smaller, more precise movements. The gigantic metal arm was great in a fight, but useless for making a cup of coffee. He had been skipping his therapy a lot lately, and his apartment bore the brunt of his negligence. Nearly everything he owned, from chairs, cabinets, doors, and countertops, were fractured, cracked, or completely shattered from Kelvin's careless metal arm. The only thing in Kelvin's apartment that was tailored to his unique physique was his bed, and he was grateful for that. The bed was a slightly angled contraption full of grooves and indentations that accommodated his half-robotic body. Once he was secured in position, he could relax, cradled and supported by the bed. It almost gave him a feeling of weightlessness. He never had trouble falling asleep since he was permanently tired. Kelvin was awoken suddenly by a pounding on his apartment door. Someone was outside, yelling and rambling incoherently. This was highly unexpected. Kelvin struggled to get out of bed and eventually opened the door. "Oh, it's you," Jerome said, seemingly unaware of where he was. "Jerome, what are you doing here?" Kelvin yawned. Kelvin's manager swayed back and forth unsteadily and rambled something incoherent. He was clearly drunk, which surprised Kelvin. Jerome had never made any attempt to hide his alcoholic intake. Rather, he often displayed it with pride. But Kelvin had never seen him like this. Jerome stumbled into Kelvin's apartment, collapsed into a chair, and started crying. Kelvin was irritated. "It's all over, Kel," Jerome cried. "Everything. All the thing. Pointless." Kelvin remained unresponsive. He stood silently, letting Jerome continue his tirade. "It's true, you know. Guilt. It's so, it's always there. Even when you're not thinking about it. You know? You know it's there, even when you don't know it's there." Jerome hung his head, quietly sobbing. Mistakes. I messed up. Big mess up. I didn't want to be here. Believe me, I'm out of options. It's all over now. It's all over now." Kelvin took the bait and impatiently asked, "What's over, Jerome?" "Shut up! I'm talking now," Jerome bellowed. "I'm a dead man. A dead man is talking now, and since I'm dead, I can say whatever I want with no repercussions. They don't care about anything. These people, the harvesters, they're everywhere, you know. They're in with Kuiper, they control everything. I thought I was safe. My family, at least, why..." Jerome started sobbing uncontrollably again. "They got my daughter," he sputtered out between tears. "They left nothing, the animals. She was so beautiful and perfect, no defects or mutations. I knew she'd be a target, but after all I did for them, they don't care. I haven't told my wife yet. It doesn't matter." Jerome suddenly sprang out of the chair with an unexpected determination. "We have to go. I need your help. You're the only one that I can rely on, Kelvin. The only one I can trust." Jerome ran into Kelvin's bedroom and started throwing clothes at him. "Get dressed," he commanded with manic energy. Kelvin found himself obeying Jerome's dictates without much thought. He didn't exactly care about what was going on with the harvesters, but Jerome was his sponsor. Apathetic as he was, Kelvin felt the weight of obligation on his back. "I have a plan," Jerome said as he rifled through Kelvin's cabinets looking for travel food. "Don't worry. I know a place we can hide out till this all blows over." "Until what blows over?" Kelvin asked cautiously. "Once my contact gets in touch with me, they'll fix everything. Come with me. Don't worry." Kelvin started to worry. Jerome whipped open the front door of Kelvin's apartment only to unexpectedly reveal a tall, elderly man who appeared to have an incalculable number of organic transplants. It was difficult to tell which parts of his body were original and which were transplants. He had 2 different sized ears, 2 different colored eyes, and a mismatched jaw that gave him a strange underbite. His hair was a scraggly, stringy mess that did little to cover the scar running up the side of his neck to the back of his head. His arms and legs were all mismatched, though at least relatively similar in size and shape. One was left to wonder how many other scars were likely hidden under his sleek, expensive suit. He was a veritable Frankenstein's monster brought to life. More dramatically, he also held a small handgun pointed directly at Jerome. While not expressly illegal, guns were difficult to come by on Sahra-2, as the Kuiper Corporation forbid the purchase and sale of them on their property, which encompassed the entire planet. Still, if you were flush with currency, you could acquire one. "Jerome," said the old man in the expensive suit. "Just the man we've been looking for." The mismatched man's underbite gave his voice a muffled slur. Jerome froze. Kelvin stood slightly off to his right. He considered the possibility that the man with the gun didn't know he was there. "It has come to our attention that you have been quite busy these past few months. I'm afraid it's time to settle your debts. Your daughter was rich in organic assets, but you still come up short. If you cannot fulfill your obligations, your wife will be next." The sound of the mismatched man callously referring to Jerome's daughter as raw assets unexpectedly triggered something deep inside of Kelvin. Without warning, he smashed his giant metal arm through the apartment wall, filling the small hallway with a cloud of wood and plaster until it connected with the old man in the expensive suit. Jerome instinctively fell to the ground. The gun went off. The old man was propelled backwards. A groaning rumble reverberated through several floors, both up and down. Kelvin coughed and dislodged his arm from the destroyed wall. He didn't know what had come over him. Had any pit fighter commentators been watching, they would have commented that Kelvin now displayed that certain ferociousness that all champion pit fighters have. Jerome leapt to his feet with a newfound clarity. Staring down the barrel of a gun has a sobering effect on a person. He patted himself down, searching for any bullet wounds, and was relieved to find none. "Let's go," was all he said. Kelvin's mechanical transplant prevented him from using the elevators, so they were forced to take the stairs. By the time they got to the ground floor of the building, a crowd of people had gathered seeking information on the disturbance heard several floors up. Fortunately, they made their way to the building entrance without incident. Kelvin followed Jerome out the door when his pit fighter instincts kicked in. He shoved Jerome forward, narrowly avoiding the giant metal arm that smashed into the ground where he had stood half a moment ago. Kelvin barely had enough time to raise his own mechanical arm and guard his face from an oncoming attack. Metal smashed into metal, and Kelvin was propelled backwards, slamming his back into the building. Despite being late at night, the interior of the domed city maintained the same muted yellow lighting it always did. Kelvin leaned against the wall and tried to orient himself. He looked up to see a large mechanical man that had just attacked him. The man's entire body looked to have some kind of mechanical modifications. It was difficult to tell if there was much of an actual man under the heap of metal. He looked like a face embedded in a tank. Kelvin had fought a few augmented pit fighters like this before. They usually did not fare that well. Full metal body types such as this were inhumanly strong and durable, but they were also slow and awkward. Movement was difficult. Likewise, you are also basically painting a huge target on your face if that's the only exposed organic body part, which is usually the last place you want to get punched during a fight. The single difference between the hulking metal beasts which Kelvin had fought before and the one currently standing in front of him was the live ammunition feeding into the latter's modified arm. Guns and other rapid-fire artillery were generally frowned upon in the pit fights as being unsportsmanlike and boring to watch. With them being so difficult to acquire in Savra-2, it was something of a self-regulating issue. The giant tank man, now towering over Kelvin, was clearly able to circumvent the difficulties in acquiring such weaponry, and it was very likely that he did not care one whit about sportsmanship. Pedestrians screamed and ran in every direction. The wall behind Kelvin was riddled with bullets moments after he dashed away. Though modified with dangerous artillery, this tank man appeared no quicker than any other Kelvin had previously fought. Kelvin's apartment building faced one of the main highways that bore much of the city's traffic. This meant that this was one of the fewer wide-open spaces in Johnston Town. providing little cover for Kelvin as he tried to avoid gunfire directed at him. Kelvin found himself in the middle of the road when a bright, white light fell on him. A small vehicle swerved slightly and tore past him at incredible speed. Acting on instinct, Kelvin leapt high into the air. Aided by the powerful thrust of his robotic legs and Sahratu's weak gravity, his trajectory sent him in a wide arc over the highway, landing directly behind the tank man. Kelvin swung his own metal arm as hard as he could. His body shook and vibrated as metal clashed with metal. The tank man was knocked onto the highway. He stumbled, barely keeping his balance, but quickly swung his torso around. The crosshairs of the arm gun fell onto Kelvin, just as a bright white light fell onto the tank man. The most common type of vehicle to travel the scant highways of Johnstontown is the worker shuttle bus. More common even than the Kuiper Corporation's middle managers' sports cars. The shuttle buses are large, able to carry 200 passengers, and heavily armed and fortified to protect the workers from the dangerous planetary elements as they travel from the domed city to the excavation sites. It was one of these shuttle buses that struck the tank man before he could open fire on Kelvin a second time. The piercing shriek of metal scraping metal echoed through the area. The tank man's metallic body parts were flung in every direction. There was no sign of the head. The bus itself skidded to a halt. Kelvin stood still as a statue. The whole incident happened so fast he almost hadn't processed it. Jerome appeared out of nowhere and commanded Kelvin to follow him. The driver climbed down from the bus, screaming invectives about fools in the street. Jerome quickly shoved a gun in the driver's face. Kelvin was not sure where the gun came from. Was it the same gun wielded by the Frankenstein man in the apartment? He could not say for sure. "Get on the bus!" Jerome yelled at the bus driver. The bus driver immediately changed his demeanor and climbed back into the driver's seat. "You too, Kelvin," Jerome ordered. "Let's go, quickly!" Kelvin did as he was told. The bus was empty. It had recently shuttled workers out to a nearby site and was returning to the station to continue on its second route. At gunpoint, Jerome had the bus driver turn around and head back toward the Johnstontown Dome exit. The driver, whose body was 100% organic with no transplants, feared that he would be the next victim of harvesters. Jerome assured him that they only needed the driver to navigate through the city, and he would be let go before they reached the exit. On that, Jerome kept his word. Upon discovery of her absence, Jerome's daughter was immediately reported missing to the proper authorities. 2 days later, there was a violent encounter at a mid-level apartment, later confirmed to be the home of Jerome's sponsored pit fighter, Kelvin Kilsith. Witnesses reported gunfire, and there were signs of physical confrontation, though no bodies were found. The whereabouts of Kilsith were unknown. 35 minutes later, there was a second report of gunfire, followed by a traffic collision between a worker shuttle bus and an unidentified cyborg. Roughly 1 hour after that, the shuttle bus driver was found stranded near a dome exit. It wasn't until after the shuttle bus exited the Johnstontown Dome suspiciously off schedule that the Kuiper Corporation security team connected the incidents together. Each worker shuttle bus came equipped with emergency environmental suits designed to mitigate some of the solar radiation and provide pure, breathable oxygen should the workers find themselves stranded outside the dome, though they did little to combat the heat of Sahratu's star. Jerome suited up easily. Though there were suits designed for employees with mechanical transplants, Kelvin had a difficult time finding something that fit his uncommon configuration. With a little bit of effort, they were able to fashion a suit that covered most of his organic body, leaving his mechanical legs and arms exposed. Jerome assured Kelvin that they wouldn't spend much time outside anyway. Jerome and Kelvin abandoned the bus a short distance from the Johnstontown entrance. They left the highway and started trekking over the rocky terrain into the pitch-black wilderness. The night sky was peppered with a swath of starlight. The wind blew big gales of dust across their path, simultaneously covering their tracks and obscuring their destination, though that didn't matter to Kelvin, as he didn't know where they were going. True to his word, it wasn't long before Jerome announced that they had arrived at their destination. A large all-terrain vehicle idled patiently in the middle of nowhere. A small person wearing a full-body environmental suit and holding a bright beacon light waved them over. "That's my contact," Jerome said to Kelvin. "Who's that with you?" the contact shouted. "A valuable asset," Jerome replied unceremoniously. Fine, get in, said the contact, waving them into the back of the vehicle. Two large doors opened and revealed a spacious cabin that comfortably fit all three passengers. Once inside the safety of the vehicle, Jerome's contact removed their environmental suit and revealed a middle-aged woman who looked younger than she acted. "Have you heard anything from my wife, Rita?" Jerome asked desperately. The woman stared daggers at Jerome and answered his question with another question. "How much does he know? Do you trust him?" Jerome clenched his fists nervously and said, "He doesn't know anything, but you can trust him. I'm his sponsor. Don't you recognize him? It's Kelvin from the pit fights." The woman glanced in Kelvin's direction. So he is. I don't really pay attention to that stuff, but you've told me plenty about him. You're right. He is a valuable asset." "That's why I brought him," Jerome said. He then turned to Kelvin, finally bringing him into the conversation, and continued, "This is Monica. She's going to fix everything for us." "Well, I don't know about everything, but I think we could build a mutually beneficial relationship. That depends mostly on Jerome, though." "Don't worry about me," Jerome said impatiently. "But now tell me about my wife. Is she safe?" The woman took a measured breath and said, "We sent her a message after we contacted you, but I cannot confirm that she received it." He took a couple of deep breaths, trying to maintain his composure, and said, "It really is all over for me here. First my daughter, then my wife. I'll be next." Then, with grim determination, he said, "This is my only option." "I trust you'll remember that when it comes time to act," Monica said sternly. Jerome hung his head and withdrew from the group. His head bobbed up and down to the rhythm of the all-terrain vehicle as it roared over Sahratu's desert landscape. Monica turned to Kelvin. "It's nice to meet you, Kelvin. Do you know why you're here?" "Because Jerome told me to come with him." Monica smirked. "Very cooperative. I can see why Jerome likes you." Kelvin wasn't sure what she meant by that. "You are here because you are evidence of the Kuiper Corporation's relation with the illegal organ harvesting ring." "I wasn't a victim of the harvesters," Kelvin corrected. "I was injured in a mining accident." "Yes, that is what you were told, but Jerome knows otherwise. Right, Jerome?" Jerome said nothing. "I work for the Sundrill Company. We've been trying to break Kuiper Corporation's control over Sahratu for years now, but they have been belligerent and refused to sell even a minority share of the mining rights to their property. Rightly so, I should add. If I had complete control over a territory, I would not sell unless I were desperate," Monica said with a sly smile before continuing. "I believe we have enough evidence to prove their involvement with, and even sanctioning of, the Harvesters criminal group. Needless to say, organ harvesting is a blatant violation of the Mining Trade Association's Human Rights Agreement. Never mind whatever sanctions the MTA would slap on them, the negative press alone would destroy Kuiper Corporation's stock value. That, one would hope, should make them desperate enough to sell." The vehicle jerked to a halt. "We're at the hideout," Monica said. The all-terrain vehicle pulled into a large industrial drill sites. The drills themselves were exposed to the elements, but were connected to a variety of protected buildings through a series of hallways. Instead of the garage or loading dock, however, they drove to the edge of the site and parked next to a large drainage pipe that directed industrial waste away from the drills. Kelvin noted that this spot provided a relatively clear view of Johnstontown over the desert plain. They had not actually traveled that far. Monica exited the vehicle and led them to the opening of the pipe. It was as dry as the rest of Sahratu. The remnants of a protective grating clung to the edges of the pipe, giving way to a large hole recently cut through the barrier. Monica directed them into the pipe. After a short walk, they were forced to crawl as the pipe steadily inclined. Someone had affixed planks of wood and steel spikes to create a rudimentary ladder system. Kelvin had to scale it using only his organic arm, lest he destroy the entire apparatus. They eventually came upon a service hatch that opened up into the upper platform of the main sonic drill. From there, they found an enclosed tunnel that led to one of the main employee buildings. The trio entered into a small room that looked like a spaceship docking foyer. Signs that reminded employees to seal their environmental suits covered the walls. Once inside, they eagerly shed their environmental suits. "The site is abandoned," Monica said. "It's currently tied up in bureaucratic red tape for safety reasons. The pit caves have expanded within several hundred kilometers of this site, and have reported dangerous increases in seismic activity. There is an internal dispute between the housing division and the mining division over which asset is more exploitable. It's been mothballed until they can figure it out. Why couldn't we just park in the garage and go through the front door like normal people? Jerome asked. We're trying to keep a low profile, in case you haven't noticed, Monica replied curtly. My contacts within Kuiper can be paid to look the other way, but we still have to avoid detection by the facility's automatic security sensors at the main entrance. Kelvin and Jerome followed Monica into what looked like a large cafeteria. Rows of tables and chairs filled the eerily quiet room. Boxes and crates were scattered recklessly across the tables. What's in the boxes? Jerome asked. Oh. In addition to corporate espionage, we've been running a little smuggling operation. Off the books, of course. Luxury items, mostly. Clothes, food, guns, alcohol, and toys and stuff. And information about Sundrill's union benefits and quality of life assurances, Monica said with a dry satisfaction. We are probably responsible for about 45% of all contraband on Sahara 2. All in our ongoing effort to destabilize Kuiper employee morale. Jerome reached into the nearest box and pulled out a bottle of wine. Hey, now we're talking, he said as he popped the cork. Monica pointed to a door that led into a kitchen. There should be some food rations in there, she said, and then pointed to several other doors on the other side of the room. There are also crew quarters over there for employees working double shifts. Kelvin, you probably worked a site similar to this. You should be familiar with the layout. He did, and he was. I'm going to check the other offices to make sure our position is secure, said Monica. She paused in a doorway and turned back to face Jerome and Kelvin. Jerome, she said, you should tell him the truth. He deserves to know. I won't be gone long. Monica left Jerome and Kelvin alone in awkward silence. She's right, he gulped out before taking a swig from the wine bottle. You do. Come on, let's grab a midnight snack out of the kitchen. The kitchen was mostly full of non-perishable food items and rationing kits. Dried, salted meats were the most popular food on Sahara 2, the second favorite being dried, salted fruits and vegetables, though they were harder to come by. Jugs of unopened purified water sat patiently on a countertop, ignored by Jerome in favor of the wine. Boy, these Sundrill people got a pretty slick operation going, you know that? Jerome said as he rifled through the cabinet looking for food. Jerome playfully tossed Kelvin a packet of dried meats. The wine began to take its desired effect as Jerome's movements got a little looser, and he seemed to sway to an unheard melody. He continued, I mean, I never worked for Kuiper Corporation directly, but it's plain to see how corrupt they are. Just look at Johnstontown. And that's a good city. You should see Carlinville. Yeesh. Jerome continued to ramble nervously, stopping intermittently to sip from the wine bottle before Kelvin interrupted him. Jerome, what did that woman mean when she said I was evidence? Kelvin demanded. Jerome fell back into a hard plastic chair that screeched as its metal legs skidded across the floor under his weight. Come on, Kelvin, Jerome sputtered. You really don't know? I mean, you have to have always suspected. Jerome finished the bottle of wine and threw it against the wall. It did not break. I'm sorry. Forget I said that. I didn't mean... Jerome stumbled as he searched for the right words. Look, man, he finally said. You were never in a mining accident. You were just another victim of the harvesters. The words hung in the air as they processed through Kelvin's mind. Jerome stared at his feet, unable to meet Kelvin's gaze. How do you know this? Kelvin asked. I lied to you, Kelvin. I didn't make my money on off-world stocks. I work with the harvesters. I don't, do any harvesting. I just make deals, find targets, stuff like that. It's my fault you got targeted. I picked you out. A healthy young man with no family to snoop around after him. You were a perfect target. We left you with one arm, and I decided to sponsor you for the pit fights. Better than dying, right? It was just a little side hustle, mutually beneficial for the both of us, you know? It took Kelvin a minute to process what Jerome was telling him. For the first time since his accident, which he now knew to be no accident, Kelvin felt a surge of uncontrollable emotions. His organic arm began to twitch. Kelvin struggled to find the right words and muttered, "My whole life, everything is a lie. How could you do..." Jerome cut him off and shouted, "Because I'm a bad person, okay? What do you want from me? This whole planet is nothing but miserable people working for a miserable company. Maybe I wanted a little more out of life for me and my family. I wasn't going to get it working from Kuiper, that's for sure. That's the difference between me and you, Kel. Here's the truth for you. You just coast through life and accept whatever bad hand is dealt to you. I went out and did something about it. Maybe I didn't do a good job of it, but I still tried. And now my daughter..." Jerome paused, unsuccessfully fighting back drunken tears. "God, I've ruined everything. My wife. I've got nothing left. Kuiper knows I turned on them. I thought I could get more from Sundrel, but it's so stupid. They're gonna kill me. Sundrel doesn't care. They're just using me like everyone else did." Jerome wept. He couldn't bring himself to look Kelvin in the eyes. "Just kill me," he cried. "Kill me already. If anyone deserves to, it's you." Kelvin looked down upon Jerome with a mix of anger and disgust. His large robotic arm shifted slightly. Nobody in Johnstontown would blame him for taking righteous retribution on Jerome. Jerome fell out of the chair and began to writhe on the floor, still sobbing and begging for Kelvin to kill him. Kelvin took several deep breaths. This pathetic, suicidal wretch that lay beneath him was not even worth his contempt. Killing him wouldn't change anything. That much was true. Then he thought, maybe Jerome was right. Maybe Kelvin didn't have it in him to take action, even if it was justified. Kelvin left Jerome to wallow in his misery and went back into the cafeteria. His organic left arm shook uncontrollably. His mechanical right arm came into contact with a nearby table uncontrollably and smashed it to bits. His thoughts scrambled in all directions. He couldn't focus on anything but bitter resentment. Then, out of nowhere, Kelvin's attention was drawn to a strange rustling sound. He walked over to a large crate on the floor in the corner. There was a distinct scratching sound coming from inside. Kelvin stared at the crate for a second and just listened. There was a thump and a bump, followed by a whine and a whimper. Wasting no more time, Kelvin gripped the top of the crate with his robotic arm and gave it a sharp yank. The top of the crate broke and ripped off, revealing a tiny four-legged creature inside. It had a small head with a pointed snout, triangle ears, and a long, fluffy tail. Its hair was a fiery orange color, with a white underbelly and dark brown paws. It recoiled as it bathed in the artificial light of the cafeteria. Kelvin was mesmerized. He had never seen a live animal before. There were no indigenous animals on Sah-Ra-Tu. He had seen pictures and videos on the Kuiper Corp telecast, of course, but never in person. He'd heard that some people were able to import pets, though it was incredibly expensive. Without a second thought, he leaned over and reached his metal arm into the crate to touch the creature. The animal bared its teeth and growled before biting at him. The animal nipped at him a few times before it realized the large arm was too tough to bite through. Kelvin pulled his metal arm back, fearing that he might hurt the creature. Remembering that he still held the packet of dried meats, he took a few pieces out and reached into the crate with his organic arm and offered some food. The four-legged animal sniffed at it hesitantly before biting hard onto the piece of meat, ripping it out of Kelvin's hand. The animal scurried into a corner and quickly chewed and swallowed the morsel of meat. Kelvin smiled. Clearly excited, the animal hopped back and forth in the crate before leaping straight up and landing on Kelvin's back. The animal stood for a moment, perched on Kelvin's back as he awkwardly stayed bent over it so as not to scare it. Then it jumped off his back and began running around the cafeteria. After a few laps around the room, it approached Kelvin again. He held out his large mechanical arm as a perch, which the animal leapt into. Carefully, Kelvin cradled the tiny beast in his metal arm as it licked his face and eagerly received more pieces of food. "It's called a fox," said Monica as she entered the room. "I have told them 1,000,000 times to quit sending pets. They rarely survive the trip and aren't worth the cost. That animal costs about the same as a junior executive's yearly salary." Monica watched the fox play with Kelvin and conceded, "But people do love them. I guess he belongs to you now. We weren't going to have time to disseminate any of this stuff anyway. Be ashamed to leave it here by itself, I guess." Monica sat down at a nearby table and relaxed a bit. She looked toward the direction of the kitchen and heard the soft whimpering of Jerome. What did Jerome tell you? She asked. The truth, Kevin admitted. Jerome is unstable, Monica said politely. Oftentimes he's a little too eager to tell people what they want to hear. It's gotten him into a lot of trouble. Kelvin let out a mirthless chuckle and said, Well, I definitely did not want to hear what he just told me. Undoubtedly. I know this is a lot for you to take on so suddenly, but I think Sundrill can help you. So what happens now? Kelvin asked impatiently. Tomorrow we leave Sahratu, Monica said. I'd like you to come with us. This information shook Kelvin, as he had often daydreamed about leaving but never considered it as a plausible option. Monica continued. Kuiper has become aware of Jerome's betrayal. It's no longer safe for us here. With the data Jerome helped compile, I believe we can conclusively link several of Kuiper Corporation's top executives with the Harvesters criminal group. We have several journalists sympathetic to Sundrill's interests ready to release the information publicly. We are also preparing a dozen lawsuits on behalf of selected victims of Kuiper's crimes against humanity. I think you could be a central figure in all this. What choice do I have? Kelvin asked rhetorically. Not much, Monica answered. I'm not going to make you do anything, but you know as well as I do that there is nothing left for you here. Sundrill has a lot to offer you in exchange for your help, starting with new prosthetics, assuming you want them. Those heavy metal pieces seem so unmanageable. What's that gonna cost me? Kelvin asked sarcastically. Not as much as you stand to gain from the lawsuit, honestly. You'd be surprised at how much cheaper prosthetics are back on Earth. The materials are of higher quality, too. You may even be able to get an organic transplant. Acquired legally, of course. I hear the price of cloned limbs has really come down in recent years. Sundrill is willing to cover all the costs. They considered an investment in their ongoing war with the Kuiper Corporation. There was a loud clatter of things being knocked over in the kitchen. I'd better go check on Jerome. Use the crew quarters and get some rest. I've arranged transport off this rock on a freighter rocket later this afternoon. It leaves in 8 hours, Monica said, and left Kelvin alone with his thoughts. Rather than go to the crew quarters, Kelvin set the Fox down and went back to the docking foyer. The Fox followed him. He didn't bother to don his environmental suit. The thing didn't fit right anyway. Besides, according to the clock on the wall, the sun should be rising at that exact moment. Dawn was the safest time of day to be outside on Sahratu. The air was still thin, and the radiation levels higher than preferred, but the temperature was just right. There were many mornings at his old work site that he and his friends would sneak out and watch the Sahratu star rise. They were always careful not to stay out too long, lest they sign their own death warrant. But the risk was worth it to bathe in the natural starlight and breathe fresh air, thin though it may be. Kelvin tried to leave the Fox inside, but it nudged his leg with its snout and whined. It did not want to be alone anymore. In retrospect, it was probably not a good idea to take the Fox outside, but Kelvin was new to handling animals and didn't really know anything about pet safety. Together, they entered the foyer and followed the enclosed tunnel to the outside upper platform. As soon as he stepped outside, every hair in his body stood at attention. A shiver ran through his chest and his skin tingled. He breathed deep and smiled. The star was just barely peeking over the horizon, eclipsed by Johnstontown. The slightest bit of deep yellow light danced around the great shadow cast by the domed city. Kelvin pulled his shirt's hood over his head to protect his ears from the slight windy chill in the air. The Fox was nervous and crept carefully behind Kelvin. Its whole world just got inconceivably bigger. Kelvin noticed the Jerry Fox and scooped it up with his metallic hand. Kelvin didn't spend much more time in the exposed air. He briskly made his way to the service hatch on the drainage pipe and followed the path back to the destroyed grate. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the city. It slowly came into focus as the star rose higher and higher. Kelvin spent nearly an hour in the pipe, just relaxing and meditating. The Fox also seemed content. With his organic hand, Kelvin petted and scratched the Fox's ears. He stared at his large metal hand. From an outsider's perspective, it was obvious that he should go with Monica and be a part of Sundrill's plans. Yet he still harbored some anxiety over the succession of events that led him here. Going from being used by Kuiper Corp to being used by Jerome, is he any less an inactive passenger in his own life if he goes on to be used by Sundrill? Kevin's ruminations were interrupted by Monica screaming his name through the pipe. Kelvin! There you are! Monica emerged from the dark recess of the pipe, wearing her environmental suit. "What are you doing out here? Where's your environmental suit? Are you crazy?" "I'm fine. Just relaxing and thinking." Monica cut him off. "It doesn't matter. Come on, we gotta go, now. Get back to the ATV." "Where's Jerome?" "I don't know. That stupid cretin up and disappeared. Walked right out the front door and tripped all these silent alarms. In a few minutes, this whole place will be swarmed with Kuiper security goons." Monica jumped out of the pipe, opened the doors to the ATV, and started the vehicle. Kelvin crawled out of the pipe and winced as the full heat of the star assaulted his face. The star was barely in the sky, but the heat was already approaching unsuitable levels. Kelvin placed the Fox in the back of the vehicle and then surveyed the horizon. He spotted Jerome wandering aimlessly in the opposite direction of Johnstontown. He wasn't wearing an environmental suit. "There he is," Kelvin said, pointing him out to Monica. "That suicidal idiot," spat Monica. "Let's go get him. Then we can head back to the city." "No time," Monica said gravely, and pointed out the 2 cloud trails coming from Johnstontown. 2 all-terrain vehicles were speeding his direction. "They must have spotted him. Well, I hate to say it, but at least he may have given us the distraction we need to slip out of here. I've got all of Jerome's data backed up at several locations. At this point, you're more valuable than he is. Jerome is expendable." Without acknowledging anything Monica said, Kelvin took off at a sprinter's pace. He ignored the frenzied tirade she threw at his departure. His mechanical legs propelled him over the dusty desert plains faster than an all-natural human, but he was still not faster than an ATV engine. Kelvin reached Jerome just before the oncoming ATVs. He leapt through the air and tackled his friend. A hail of gunfire passed over them as they fell to the ground. Several unidentified people in environmental suits flooded out of the ATVs. They all brandished large guns. Kelvin jumped up, ready to fight, but his instincts kicked in, and he stopped himself when he saw all the guns trained on him. "Move and you're dead," one of them shouted. Kelvin complied. "Kelvin," said a man with a recognizable muffled slur, "we don't want to hurt you. We just want Jerome. You have been a valuable asset to this company as a pit fighter. You have a long career ahead of you still. It is a constant struggle for Kuiper Corporation to weed out industrial spies and opportunists. Kuiper Corporation rewards whistleblowers very handsomely. If you were to help expose any traitors to the company..." The muffled man's offer was cut off by the increasingly loud sound of an oncoming engine. "Look out!" shouted one of the Kuiper Corp people. They all turned and immediately opened fire at Monica's ATV. Kelvin moved with lightning speed. He charged the lead man with the muffled voice. The man tried to turn back and shoot at Kelvin when he realized what was happening, but it was too late. Kelvin planted his huge metal arm into the ground, hurling himself feet first in a big swooping motion. His steel feet connected with the man's head and propelled him back several meters. The Frankenstein man's body skidded several meters across the rocky terrain. He never got up again. Monica's ATV reached them seconds later. The vehicle was moving differently than it was before. It was full of bullet holes and probably not operating at full efficiency, but it was also no longer being driven by the computer. Monica was driving it manually. The vehicle swerved and slid into the small crowd of the Kuiper Corp people. Some of them jumped out of the way. Some of them did not. The few remaining Kuiper Corp men that could walk scrambled back to their vehicle. Monica leapt out of the back of her own ATV. "We can't let them get away," she shouted, as she picked up a gun off the ground and steadied her aim at the Kuiper Corp ATV. Kelvin ignored her and charged the enemy vehicle as his opponents fearfully scrambled to climb inside. The engine started up just as Kelvin reached the front of the vehicle. With all his might, he smashed his giant metal fist into the front of the vehicle and into the engine. The vehicle sputtered and stopped. With a little effort, he managed to pull his arm out of the ATV wreckage. His metal hand was now mangled and missing fingers. "Good thing you left one intact," Monica said, motioning for Kelvin to get inside the other Kuiper Corp ATV. "My ATV is as good as dead. They'll be stranded out here for a few hours before rescue crews can come and get them." "What about the Fox?" Kelvin asked innocently. Monica held up a small bag made out of a mangled environmental suit. The Fox poked its head out of a ripped hole. "He's fine. Let's go," she shouted. Kelvin picked up Jerome and carried him to the ATV. "Why are you doing this?" Jerome coughed. "I don't know. replied Kelvin. Once everyone was safely inside the back of the ATV, Monica programmed it to head back to Johnstontown. They were able to easily bypass city security with the company car. "There's one thing we should do before we leave," Monica said. Several hours later, Kelvin sat in an underground transplant office, marveling at his new plastic arm. It was sleek, lightweight, and the same size as his organic arm. "It's just a temporary replacement until we get back to Earth. Then you can accessorize however you want." Jerome sat in a chair and petted the fox. "It looks good on you," he said. "Feels weird," Kevin said cautiously. "My whole center of balance is different." Kelvin reached his new arm out to the fox. The fox sniffed hesitantly and started licking it. "If it's good enough for Fox, then it's good enough for me," he said. "You're going to name your fox Fox?" Jerome asked. "Sure, why not?" Kelvin replied. "It's what he is." "I guess so," Jerome said unconvincingly. Monica corralled them back into the ATV, and they made their way to the rocket launch site outside of Johnstontown. Kelvin felt a level of calm he had never felt before, despite the thrill and anxiety of seeing Earth for the first time. He didn't know where his life was going to go from here, but he was confident there would be more opportunities to capitalize on. Maybe after all this stuff between Sundrill and Kuiper Corp was finished, he could find a new career. Maybe he'll meet a girl and start a family. Then he thought, why keep waiting at all? Maybe he'll kiss the first girl he sees on Earth. Well, maybe not the first. Who's he kidding? He'll never be that bold. Still, the thrill of an unknown future exhilarated him in a way he never previously thought possible. It was now up to him to make the most of it. Robot Pulp and The Hideout are copyright 2020 Aaron Walther and Ed Bickford. No part of this publication may be reproduced or transmitted in any form by any means, except short excerpts for review purposes, without express permission of the copyright holders. All names, characters, and events in this publication are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, characters, or events, without satiric intent, is purely coincidental. All rights reserved.